This is the Hey website at hey.com. The first thing that jumps out of me here is that we've got this blue to, let's call it reddish, gradient applied to this main title and this main call to action and this product video walkthrough. So they've cleverly used the same fill for each of these three important things in the hero section, and it sort of gives you the clear message that these three things are important and they're related. So you could just read the title, you could just then read the button, and you could just then watch the video, and the rest of it is sort of slightly less important. But that also sets up a nice vertical rhythm. So you've got the sort of less color and then more color, then less color, then more color, and then if you can count this as less color and then more color. So it's a nice alternating pattern as well. So it's quite a nice way to approach the hero section and make these three different things, which are a title, a button, and a video, feel coherent, feel like they are part of the same set. I've noticed that same gradient is actually used throughout, including this CTA in the bottom, and all of these titles for anything that's important. And then they don't use it, as far as I can tell, for anything that's sort of less important. So they've taken that gradient, which is a bit more visually interesting than a single color, and they've reserved it for, this is only for the most important things. So that's a nice way to brand things. It's a nice way to make things feel coherent, is you pick something and then you say, it's only going to be used for this, and you stick with that. But I also noticed, speaking of gradients, that they've got this gradient I've been talking about, which is a darker color to a lighter color. Down here for these testimonials, they're just using shades of blue, but they're still going from darker in the top left to lighter in the bottom right. Same as here. So that's another way to make it feel coherent without using the same gradient again. They could have just taken the blue to reddish gradient, placed it here, and maybe made it lighter overall so that the darker text could sit on it and be easily read. But actually they've taken that concept of a darker to lighter gradient and picked something a lot simpler, picked something that suits the background more, which blue is a cooler color, so it recedes into the background more, whereas these are much warmer colors, much bolder colors, so they would maybe interfere with the text a bit. So they've used different colors, but they've still kept this dark to light shift. So that's a nice way of making the gradients feel similar without making them particularly look similar. One thing I'd like to point out is that these drop shadows, this is nothing particularly new for visual design, but these drop shadows are a bit non-standard in the sense that they don't go all the way to the edges of the box. You can see up here maybe a bit more clearly, they start inset a bit. So the corners here are relatively clean. The shadow starts just on that bottom edge. So that's just something a bit extra you can do if you want to make your shadows, a bit more interesting. There's a squiggly line here that's used as a divider. I quite like this because it's very subtle. It's not calling attention to itself really. It's barely different from the background color. But because it's squiggly, it's still making that subtle thing have some character. So that's quite a nice way to do something subtle like a divider, is give it a little bit of character. And then if someone does notice it, it feels like it, suits the rest of the brand, the rest of the visual style. It's also a nice way to fill some space. If you wanted a bit more space between this text up here and this title down here, you could just have completely empty space. Taking a squiggly sort of characterful sprinkle like this and putting it in between means that you fill that space a little bit, but not in a way that's going to distract people, not in a way that doesn't make it feel like the space is as tall as it is. So that's just a nice way to sort of break up the emptiness, essentially. I noticed that if you look at these screenshots of the product, they've got this layering effect. So you've got the main background of the product, and then here you've got the sort of pane you're looking at, and that's got this drop shadow behind it. And so they're doing this background layer and foreground layer. I noticed that actually that's what they're doing most of the time on the website. So they've got this background layer and this foreground layer on top of it. So they've used the same sorts of layering and structure approaches they've got in the app on the website. And that's a good way to make the website feel consistent with the product. So I've talked before about consistency within, or coherence within the website, like this title, this button, this video all have the same gradient fill, but then they're being coherent with their own product. So that's a nice way, especially since you're seeing screenshots of that product here, that's a nice way of feeling like everything belongs together. So you don't have to make it look exactly like your product or vice versa, but if you can take some of the cues you're using, some of the approaches you're using in your product and bring it into your website or vice versa, then they're going to feel a lot more coherent across the board. Not just when you're looking at the screenshots versus when you're looking at the website around it, but also when you sign up for the product, it's going to feel like a continuation of the same visual style in some ways. Speaking of the screenshots, I also noticed that what they've done here is they've got this, for example, profile picture sort of circle here, and this fully rounded button. And so these are all in the interface of the product they've taken screenshots of. They've made sure to match the corners of the container for the screenshot to those buttons or elements inside the product screenshot. That's another nice way of making it feel like it all belongs together, is that clearly the container for the screenshot is aware, if you see what I mean, of the elements inside the screenshot. It's probably quite easy to just take the screenshot and then stop thinking about what's in it and start thinking just about the website and the container you're going to put the screenshot in. Here they've paid more attention to what's in the screenshot, and they've created these nested corners so that it all feels like it fits together nicely. Down here we've got a stack of papers that contains this letter from the CEO of 37 Signals. And what's nice about this is that in the actual letter, Jason's talking about the way that email used to feel. And he's talking about how it used to feel like receiving, a letter from someone. Or he's giving that sort of impression. That's how email used to feel all the time. And so they've used this visual style of a stack of papers in this long form, paper-like container with these extra containers behind that are tilted. That reinforces the message in the letter, right? So they're talking about, here's a letter, here's how getting an email used to feel. They're bringing that back to that concept of receiving a letter in the post, reading a letter. It should be something you enjoy. And so that's a nice way of not only making this big block of text more interesting to look at because you've got this more interesting container, it's also reinforcing the concept behind the big block of text. Down here we've got this sort of call-out container, let's call it. It's basically saying that, hey, it's getting a calendar. And you might notice the squiggly lines used as these dividers or borders either side of this call-out container. That matches the squiggly lines in these dividers here. So even though these are much more subtle, you're still getting that first impression of, okay, there's squiggles involved. I don't think there's many of those squiggles elsewhere in the website, not that I can see, but they're sort of setting up that pattern here in these dividers. And then when it comes time to this call-out container, they're using it to good effect because this squiggly line really jumps out at you with this bold blue contrasted with off-white in the background. They're using that squiggly line suddenly as a way to draw your attention, whereas before it was used in a very subtle way that was just adding some character. So that's a nice way of using the same pattern in two different places for two different purposes, but it all makes it, again, feel much more coherent as a visual style. The callout container here is about calendars, and they've taken a screenshot of what I don't know if it's their calendar or just a standard calendar app. They've taken a screenshot of a relatively simple looking calendar. It's got these repeating boxes. Then they've overlaid it with blue. They've faded it out. They've not tried to take the attention away from They've not tried to take the attention away from the text itself. But this is quite nice because it's relatively easy to take a screenshot of a calendar and then put a color overlay on it, make it more subtle, de-emphasize it. But that gives you this nice background texture that by default, because you've taken a screenshot of a calendar, fits the concept of the callout container, which is talking about calendars. So that's a very nice way. You could do the same thing where you take a screenshot of whatever the container is talking about, but make it really subtle. So it's giving sort of hints at the concept of calendar, but you're not really meant to focus on it or pay too much attention to the background. And the final thing I wanted to talk about was this call to action in the bottom right corner. Usually I expect to see sort of a chatbot or some kind of help function here question mark, that sort of thing, or it's something that's popping up and saying, oh, hey, can we help you, trying to get my attention. Here they've taken that space that the pattern usually occupies and instead put the standard call to action there. So it's not at the top here where you might expect it for a sticky navigation bar, which doesn't exist here. They put it at the bottom, which is probably you're more likely to be focusing in the bottom half of the screen as you're scrolling down, right? And so this is always there ready to go if you want to click it and go through. So I find this a much better use of the space, and I like that they're subverting that pattern of putting the support button in the bottom right. Instead, they're putting something that you might actually want to click. Whereas personally, I basically never want to click those chat buttons because I'm on the website reading about the product. I don't really want to speak to someone about it. But here they've used that space for something more useful, and I quite like that, especially because it disappears when you're up here and there's already a call to action here as well. As you start scrolling, suddenly it appears, and it's not taking up vertical space. It sort of gets out of your way.